The autumn wind rolled across the plains of Montana like an old memory, carrying with it the scent of dry grass, horses, and distant rain. Red Willow was a small frontier town, little more than a scattering of wooden buildings gathered beneath endless skies, but people spoke of one place more than any other: the Iron Ridge Ranch. The ranch stretched across thousands of acres of rolling land, bordered by pine forests and rocky hills. It was one of the largest properties in the territory, and its owner was a man many admired but few truly knew. Caleb Mercer had returned home after years away. Some said he had fought in range wars farther west. Others claimed he had spent years driving cattle through dangerous territories where men carried rifles as often as they carried words. Nobody knew the full truth, and Caleb never offered explanations. He was 35 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, and carried himself like a man who had learned long ago that silence was safer than conversation. People noticed the old scar along his jaw. They noticed the slight stiffness in his left shoulder. Most of all, they noticed his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much. Caleb lived alone at Iron Ridge Ranch with a handful of workers and an aging housekeeper named Martha Doyle. The ranch was successful, but it lacked something everyone in town talked about. It lacked a family. After his father's death, the final ownership papers for Iron Ridge had come with one condition. Caleb had to marry, not because the law demanded it, but because his father believed a man should not spend his life alone. Caleb had no interest in romance. He had no interest in dances, social gatherings, or charming young ladies eager to become the wife of a wealthy ranch owner. What he wanted was simple: peace, a quiet house, a place where the world could not find him. That was why, on a cool October afternoon, he rode into town and accepted an invitation from Edwin Holloway. Edwin was a businessman whose fortunes had begun to decline over the years. His warehouse business was struggling, and everyone knew he hoped one of his daughters might make a favorable marriage. As Caleb tied his horse outside the Holloway house, curtains shifted in neighboring windows. Half the town already knew why he had come. Inside, the Holloway family prepared as if a governor himself were arriving. Victoria Holloway stood before a mirror, carefully arranging the curls of her dark hair. "Remember," she said to her younger sister Eleanor, "Mr. Mercer doesn't attend social events often. We must make an impression." Eleanor closed her book with a confident smile. "I intend to discuss land investments and railroad expansion," she said. "Men appreciate intelligence." Victoria laughed softly. "Men appreciate beauty first." Across the room, Lydia quietly folded napkins at the dining table. Nobody asked her opinion. Nobody expected her to impress anyone. That had always been her place in the family. Victoria was admired. Eleanor was respected. Lydia was useful. At 22, Lydia had become invisible in her own home. She managed the kitchen accounts. She remembered which workers needed extra blankets in winter. She repaired torn clothes. She cared for her father when illness struck. Yet people rarely noticed. And perhaps because no one noticed her, Lydia had learned to notice everything. She noticed the worry lines on her father's face. She noticed the cracks forming in the walls of the house. She noticed the letters from creditors hidden in desk drawers. And now, she noticed the approaching sound of horse hooves outside. Caleb had arrived. Edwin Holloway hurried to the front door with nervous excitement. "Mr. Mercer," he said warmly. "Welcome. Please come in." Caleb stepped inside, removing his hat. Rain dust covered his coat. His boots were worn from long travel. He looked less like a wealthy ranch owner and more like a man who had spent years under open skies. Victoria entered the room first. Her smile was practiced and graceful. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we are honored by your visit." Caleb nodded politely. Eleanor followed, carrying a book about Western trade routes. She spoke confidently about railroads and future investments. Caleb listened quietly. Then his eyes drifted toward the far side of the room. Lydia stood near the kitchen doorway, carrying a tray of cups. She did not step forward. She did not try to attract attention. For a moment, their eyes met. Then she lowered her gaze and continued her work. Dinner began shortly afterward. Victoria spoke about dances held in Helena. Eleanor discussed business opportunities and politics. Edwin laughed too loudly at every remark. Caleb answered politely, but his words remained short. Lydia noticed something others did not. Every few minutes, Caleb rubbed his left shoulder. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it carried the habit of old pain. When dinner ended, Victoria prepared sweet coffee, adding cream and sugar as guests usually preferred. Lydia paused. She looked toward Caleb. He sat quietly near the window, staring into the darkening sky. A man who spent years on the frontier. A man carrying old injuries. A man who looked tired in a way sleep could not fix. Without saying anything, Lydia brewed another cup. Strong. Black. No sugar. No cream. She carried it to him. "Mr. Mercer," she said softly. Caleb looked up. She placed the cup beside him. "I thought you might prefer this." He glanced at the coffee, then at her. "No sugar?" he asked. Lydia shook her head. "You seem like a man who prefers things honest." For the first time that evening, something changed in Caleb's expression. It wasn't quite a smile, but the hardness around his eyes softened. He lifted the cup and tasted it. The coffee was strong, simple, exactly right. "Thank you," he said quietly. Lydia nodded and returned to the kitchen. She did not stay. She did not try to impress him. Yet Caleb found his gaze following her. Later, while Victoria played piano and Eleanor discussed books, Caleb stepped onto the porch for fresh air. The evening was cool. Stars had begun appearing above the dark plains. A few moments later, Lydia stepped outside carrying folded laundry. She seemed surprised to see him. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't know anyone was here." "You don't need permission to stand on your own porch," Caleb replied. Lydia smiled faintly. For a while, they stood in silence. The wind moved softly through the trees. Then Lydia spoke. "Does the quiet out at your ranch ever feel lonely?" Caleb looked at her. It was not a question he expected. Most people asked about cattle, land, money, success. No one had ever asked that. He thought for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. Lydia nodded. "I think people often mistake silence for loneliness." Caleb looked toward the distant hills. "And what do you think it is?" She folded her hands together. "I think silence is peaceful. If there's someone beside you who understands it." The words settled between them. Simple. Honest. Caleb felt something unfamiliar. Not excitement. Not attraction. Recognition. For years, he had been surrounded by noise. Demands. Expectations. But here stood someone who understood what he could never explain. Inside the house, laughter drifted through open windows. Victoria and Eleanor were still trying to impress him. Neither realized the evening had already changed. The next morning, Edwin Holloway invited Caleb into his office. The older man smiled nervously. "I trust you found the evening pleasant?" Caleb nodded. "I did." Edwin leaned forward. "My daughters would make excellent wives." Caleb looked out the window. Lydia was in the yard, helping an old ranch hand repair a broken fence. She laughed quietly at something the man said. No performance, no audience, just kindness. Caleb turned back. "I have made my decision." Edwin's face brightened. Word spread quickly through the house. Victoria adjusted her dress. Eleanor straightened her posture. Both waited confidently. Caleb entered the room. Everyone fell silent. He looked at Victoria, then Eleanor, and finally, Lydia. "I would like to ask Miss Lydia Holloway to become my wife." Silence. Complete silence. Victoria's smile vanished. Eleanor stared in disbelief. Edwin looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Lydia stood motionless. The forgotten daughter. The quiet girl. The one no one had seen. And somehow, she had been chosen. Caleb Mercer had never imagined his wedding day. If anyone had asked him years earlier, he would have said a wedding belonged to other men. Men who dreamed about families, laughter, and children racing across open fields. His own dreams had been much simpler. Finish the day's work. Keep the ranch alive. Sleep without remembering the past. Yet 3 days after leaving the Holloway house, he stood inside the little white church on the edge of Red Willow, waiting for the woman he barely knew to become his wife. The ceremony was small. No musicians. No decorated wagons. No celebration stretching into the evening. Only a handful of witnesses gathered beneath the old wooden rafters while the morning sun filtered through colored glass windows. Outside, horses stamped impatiently in the crisp autumn air. Inside, the silence felt strangely comfortable. Lydia arrived wearing a simple cream-colored dress that had belonged to her late mother. There were no expensive jewels around her neck, no elaborate hairstyle. She carried only a small bouquet of prairie wildflowers gathered that morning. Victoria watched from the front pew with a smile that never reached her eyes. Eleanor kept staring at the floor. Neither sister understood how everything had changed so quickly. Only Edwin Holloway seemed relieved. His debts would soon disappear. His family's future had been secured. Whether his youngest daughter found happiness mattered far less than the agreement now waiting to be signed. When the preacher asked Caleb if he accepted Lydia as his wife, his answer came quietly. "I do." Lydia looked into his steady gray eyes. "I do." Moments later, the rings were exchanged. There was no dramatic kiss, only a respectful nod between two strangers beginning a life neither had expected. By noon, Lydia's small trunk had already been loaded into Caleb's wagon. She hugged her father first. His embrace lasted only a moment. Then Victoria offered a stiff farewell. "I hope country life suits you." "It will," Lydia answered gently. Eleanor forced a smile. "You'll be terribly bored." "Perhaps," Lydia replied. "But boredom is kinder than constant competition." Neither sister knew how to answer. Lydia climbed into the wagon beside Caleb. She never looked back as Red Willow slowly disappeared behind them. The road toward Iron Ridge Ranch stretched across endless golden grasslands. For nearly an hour, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were wagon wheels rolling over dirt and the rhythmic footsteps of two powerful draft horses. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "You don't have to be nervous." "I'm not. You hide it well." She smiled faintly. "I've spent most of my life being overlooked." He glanced toward her. "You don't seem angry about that." "I was for a while." "What changed?" Lydia watched hawks circling high above the prairie. "I realized anger only hurts the person carrying it." Caleb considered those words for several minutes. Most conversations he'd endured over the years revolved around money, land, or ambition. Lydia answered questions as though she had no interest in impressing anyone, only telling the truth. The afternoon passed beneath clear blue skies. As sunset painted the western mountains orange, Iron Ridge Ranch finally appeared on the horizon. Lydia had expected something grand. Instead, she found something tired. The entrance fence leaned badly to one side. Several barns needed repairs. One windmill stood completely still. The main ranch house remained beautiful despite peeling paint and weathered timber. It looked like a proud old soldier refusing to admit age had finally caught him. Caleb noticed her studying everything. "It isn't much to look at." "I disagree." He raised an eyebrow. "It has good bones." He laughed quietly. It surprised even him. "You sound like Martha." "Who's Martha?" "Our housekeeper." "I'll probably like her." "You probably will." The wagon rolled into the yard. Workers paused to watch. Most had never seen Caleb bring anyone home. Martha Doyle stepped onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands. She was nearly 60, with silver hair tied beneath a faded blue bonnet. "So," she said with a knowing smile, "you finally listened to your father." Caleb removed his hat. "I suppose I did." Martha walked toward Lydia. Instead of inspecting her clothes or jewelry, she simply offered both hands. "Welcome home." The words caught Lydia off guard. Home. No one had ever greeted her that way before. "Thank you. You'll find this place untidy." "I've already noticed." Martha laughed. "Then you'll fit in just fine." Inside, the ranch house felt enormous. High ceilings, wide wooden staircases, long hallways lined with old family portraits. Yet something felt missing. Warmth. The rooms were clean enough, but lifeless, as though people merely existed there instead of living. Caleb carried Lydia's trunk upstairs. He stopped outside two separate doors. "This room is yours." She looked at the second door across the hallway. "And yours?" He nodded. She understood immediately. He wasn't being cruel, simply cautious. Our arrangement doesn't need to change overnight, he explained. I appreciate that. If you need anything, Martha knows the house better than I do. I'll manage. I expected you would. He hesitated, almost as though he wanted to say something more. Instead, he tipped his hat slightly. Dinner is at 7. Then he disappeared downstairs. Lydia entered her room alone. It overlooked miles of rolling pasture. The furniture was sturdy but old. Dust gathered in the corners. Curtains had faded from years beneath the western sun. She opened the window. Fresh mountain air rushed inside. For the first time in years, she had a room entirely her own. No sisters arguing. No footsteps outside her door. No whispered comparisons. Only quiet. She smiled. Dinner that evening felt almost formal. Caleb sat at one end of the long table, Lydia at the other. Between them stretched enough empty space for 6 more people. Martha served roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Neither newlywed spoke very much. How was the trip? Martha asked. Peaceful, Lydia answered. And the house? It needs love. Martha nearly laughed into the serving bowl. Caleb looked up. You've been here less than 2 hours. I know. And already you've diagnosed the place. I've only stated the obvious. He couldn't argue. The meal continued quietly. Later that night, Lydia wandered through the downstairs rooms carrying a small oil lamp. She noticed little things. Loose floorboards. Cracked window frames. A grandfather clock that had stopped years ago. Shelves coated in dust. Flowers missing from every windowsill. She wrote everything inside a small notebook. The following morning, she rose before sunrise. Workers already filled the yard. Instead of staying inside as everyone expected, Lydia tied on a plain apron and walked toward the kitchens. Cook Sarah nearly dropped a skillet. Your Grace. Lydia smiled. My name is Lydia. We don't usually see the lady of the house down here. Perhaps you should. She spent the morning helping prepare breakfast. Not because anyone ordered her, because she genuinely enjoyed working. When breakfast finished, she visited the storeroom. Shelves overflowed with supplies. Half of them spoiled. Several expensive items sat unopened while essentials were nearly gone. She quietly began writing another list. By afternoon, she had discovered broken tools, duplicate orders, wasted flour, and enough unused blankets to outfit another ranch. Nothing had been organized in years. Late that evening, Caleb returned from inspecting cattle. His boots were covered in mud. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. As he entered the kitchen, he froze. Everything looked different. Pots hung neatly. Shelves had been labeled. The room smelled of fresh bread instead of stale smoke. Martha stood proudly with folded arms. Your wife has been busy. Caleb looked around. You did all this? Lydia nodded. There wasn't much else to do. It would have taken me weeks. You probably had more important things. He looked at the orderly kitchen again. It feels different, better. He considered it. Alive. Over the next several weeks, the changes continued. Lydia never issued loud commands. She simply worked. She organized food storage. She repaired old curtains herself. She planted flowers beneath the porch. She learned every worker's name. She remembered whose child had been sick. She baked extra bread for older ranch hands. Within a month, everyone smiled more often. The ranch somehow breathed easier. Even the horses seemed calmer. One rainy evening, Caleb returned home earlier than usual. He found Lydia sitting alone in the office studying old account books. What are those? Your expense records. He frowned. I've avoided those for years. I noticed. She pointed towards several columns. You're paying almost double for grain deliveries. I am. The supplier assumes no one checks. Caleb pulled out a chair. She calmly explained every unnecessary expense she'd discovered. He listened in complete silence. When she finally finished, he stared at the pages. You figured all this out? It wasn't difficult. I've owned this ranch for 6 years. You've been busy running cattle. What have you been doing? She smiled softly. Watching. He leaned back. For the first time since his father's death, the burden on his shoulders felt a little lighter. Days turned into weeks. Weeks slowly became months. Their marriage remained quiet. They still occupied separate bedrooms. They still spoke only during meals, or while discussing ranch business. Yet something subtle had begun changing. One evening, after another long day, Caleb sat alone on the porch watching the sunset disappear behind distant mountains. Lydia stepped outside carrying 2 steaming mugs. She handed him one. Strong black coffee. No sugar. He smiled before taking the first sip. You remembered. You seem like a man who doesn't change his mind about coffee. He laughed quietly. No. For several peaceful minutes, they watched the fading light together. Finally, Caleb spoke. You've transformed this ranch. I've only cared for it. Why? She looked across the fields where workers were returning home. Because someone should love the place you stopped loving. The word struck harder than any accusation. Caleb lowered his eyes toward the coffee in his hands. For years he had believed surviving was enough. Keeping Iron Ridge standing had seemed like victory. He had forgotten a home needed more than walls. It needed hope. He turned toward Lydia. The evening breeze lifted a strand of her brown hair across her face. Without realizing it, he smiled. It was the first genuine smile anyone at Iron Ridge had seen from Caleb Mercer in years. And though neither of them spoke another word before darkness settled over the ranch, both quietly understood that their marriage was no longer built only on duty. Somewhere between silence, shared work, and simple kindness, its foundation had begun to change. The first snow arrived earlier than anyone expected. It began as a thin white dusting across the distant mountains, barely noticeable against the gray morning sky. By afternoon, the wind had grown sharper, carrying icy flakes that drifted lazily over the open range. Old ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances. This winter's coming angry, one of them muttered while tightening a saddle. Caleb looked toward the western hills. The clouds were thick and black, moving far too quickly. We'll move the cattle into the lower pasture today, he ordered. No delays. The workers scattered immediately. Inside the ranch house, Lydia noticed the sudden urgency. Martha hurried through the kitchen. The men only rush like that when trouble's coming. Lydia stepped onto the porch. The cold wind bit at her cheeks. Across the yard, Caleb was already saddling his favorite horse. She walked toward him. Is it serious? He tightened the saddle strap. The mountains are warning us. She looked toward the dark horizon. I don't understand. My father used to say the mountains always speak before winter. And what are they saying today? Caleb paused. They're telling us to prepare. Within hours, Iron Ridge Ranch transformed into a hive of activity. Workers stacked firewood. Barn doors were reinforced. Water barrels were filled. Extra blankets were distributed. Lydia refused to remain inside. She joined Martha in checking food supplies. Together they counted flour sacks, dried beans, smoked meat, candles, lamp oil, and medical supplies. If the roads close, Martha explained, we may not see town for weeks. Lydia carefully updated every inventory list. We'll make everything last. That evening, snow covered the ranch in a quiet blanket of white. The world looked peaceful, beautiful, but Caleb couldn't relax. He stood on the porch long after everyone else had gone inside. Lydia stepped beside him, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. You've barely spoken all day. He accepted the mug. The first storm is never the dangerous one. She looked toward him. What comes after? The second. 2 days later, it arrived. The wind screamed across the prairie before sunrise. Snow slammed against the ranch house, so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel striking the windows. The temperature dropped so quickly that water buckets froze solid before breakfast. By noon, visibility had shrunk to only a few yards. Workers tied ropes between the house, barns, and bunkhouse so nobody would become lost in the whiteout. Even experienced cowboys struggled to stay upright. The storm grew worse every hour. Inside, everyone gathered around the large stone fireplace. The windows rattled violently. The roof groaned beneath heavy snow. Lydia carried hot soup from the kitchen, while Martha wrapped blankets around frightened ranch hands who had barely escaped the freezing wind. Caleb entered covered in snow. Ice clung to his beard. We've brought every horse inside except those in the south barn. Why not bring them now? Lydia asked. The drifts are too deep. He removed his gloves. We'll wait until morning. Before anyone could answer, a flash of brilliant white lit the sky. A deafening crack shook the entire ranch. The lights flickered. Then someone shouted from outside, "Fire!" Every person inside froze. Caleb rushed to the nearest window. Lightning had struck the South Hay barn. Flames climbed the roof despite the heavy snowfall. Dry hay burned like oil. "Oh no," Martha whispered. Several frightened horses were still trapped inside. Without hesitation, Caleb grabbed his coat. Lydia caught his arm. "The roof will collapse." "I know. You can't go alone." "I don't have a choice." He disappeared into the storm before she could stop him. Outside, the wind nearly knocked him from his feet. Snow whipped across his face. The burning barn glowed through the blizzard like a giant lantern. Workers struggled toward it carrying buckets that froze almost as quickly as they were filled. Inside the barn, terrified horses kicked violently against wooden stalls. Smoke rolled beneath the roof beams. Caleb pulled open the first stall. "Easy." The frightened horse bolted into the storm. Another. Then another. A heavy beam crashed behind him. Someone outside shouted, "The roof's giving way." Still Caleb kept moving. There was one more horse trapped near the back. Inside the ranch house, Lydia stared through the storm. She could barely see the flames. Then she noticed something. "The support beam," she whispered. Martha looked up. "What? If that center beam falls—" She didn't finish. She simply grabbed her heavy coat. Martha blocked the doorway. "You are absolutely not going. He'll die." "So will you." Lydia picked up a coil of rope hanging beside the door. "He won't leave while there's still a horse inside." She pulled the door open. The wind nearly tore it from her hands. Then she disappeared into the blizzard. Snow struck her face like tiny stones. She could barely breathe. The rope tied between buildings became her only guide. Each step sank knee-deep into drifting snow. By the time she reached the burning barn, smoke and snow mixed into one choking cloud. Workers shouted everywhere. No one noticed her slipping inside. Heat slammed into her immediately. The last frightened horse kicked wildly against its stall. Caleb struggled to free tangled harness straps. The beam above them groaned. "Caleb!" He spun around. "Lydia! What are you doing here?" "The beam." He looked upward. Cracks spread across the burning timber. His eyes widened. He cut the final strap. The horse charged past them toward the open doorway. Then, the center beam snapped. "Move!" Caleb shoved Lydia forward. The burning timber crashed between them. Dust exploded into the air. Lydia fell hard against the dirt floor. For one terrifying second, she couldn't see him. "Caleb!" No answer. The flames climbed higher. Then she heard coughing. She found him pinned beneath part of the fallen beam. His injured shoulder trapped awkwardly beneath the heavy wood. She rushed toward him. "You need to leave," he shouted. "I'm not leaving you." "Lydia." "No." She wrapped both hands around the timber. It barely moved. Another loud crack echoed overhead. The entire roof trembled. Outside, workers shouted desperately. "The roof's collapsing." Lydia looked around wildly. Near the wall, she spotted a long iron fence post. She dragged it across the floor. "What are you doing?" "Trust me." She shoved one end beneath the beam. Using every ounce of strength she possessed, she pushed downward. The timber lifted just enough. Caleb pulled his trapped arm free. Now, they stumbled toward the doorway together. Behind them, the roof finally gave way. Flames burst through the ceiling as the barn collapsed into itself. The explosion of sparks shot high into the storm-dark sky. Both fell into the snow only seconds before the entire structure disappeared beneath burning debris. For several moments, neither moved. The freezing wind extinguished sparks clinging to their coats. Caleb rolled onto his back, breathing heavily. Lydia sat beside him, coughing through smoke-filled lungs. "You came back for me." She looked at him. "You would have done the same." He didn't answer, because they both knew she was right. Workers helped them back toward the ranch house. Only then did Caleb notice Lydia's hands. Her gloves had burned away. The skin across her palms was blistered and bleeding. "What happened?" She glanced down. "I suppose I grabbed something hot." "You suppose?" She smiled weakly. "I was a little distracted." Inside the house, Martha nearly burst into tears. She hurried them both toward the kitchen, where the great stone fireplace roared with heat. Everyone crowded around. Caleb ignored the others. He gently took Lydia's hands. A basin of warm water sat nearby. Without saying a word, he carefully washed soot and ash from her injured skin. Every movement was slow, careful, as though he feared causing even the smallest amount of pain. The kitchen grew unusually quiet. Workers exchanged surprised looks. No one had ever seen Caleb Mercer care for anyone like this. Lydia watched him silently. "You don't have to do this." "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm doing it because I want to." The words settled between them. Simple, honest. When he finished wrapping clean bandages around her hands, he looked up. "I nearly lost you today." She smiled softly. "You didn't." "No." He swallowed hard. "I don't think I could bear it if I had." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, something had quietly changed. Over the following week, the blizzard kept everyone trapped at Iron Ridge. Roads disappeared beneath towering snowdrifts. Travel became impossible. With nowhere to ride and no cattle to inspect, Caleb found himself spending more time inside the house than he had in years. At first, their conversations were brief. They shared coffee in the mornings, read ledgers together in the afternoons, played quiet games of checkers beside the fire during long evenings. One night, as snow tapped gently against the windows, Caleb finally spoke about the past he had spent years burying. "My younger brother was supposed to inherit Iron Ridge." Lydia looked up from her book. "What happened?" "He died during a cattle drive." His voice remained calm, but his eyes drifted toward the fire. "I blamed myself." "You weren't there?" "I chose another route that season." Silence filled the room. "I spent years wondering if one different decision would have saved him." Lydia reached across the small table. Her bandaged hand rested gently over his. "We all carry storms we couldn't stop." He looked at her. "And yours?" She smiled sadly. "I spent my childhood trying to earn love." She stared into the flames. "Eventually, I realized the people who truly love you don't keep score." Caleb squeezed her hand without thinking. Neither pulled away. The fire crackled softly. The blizzard still howled beyond the windows. But inside the old ranch house, the silence no longer belonged to two strangers bound only by circumstance. For the first time since they had spoken their wedding vows, it belonged to two people who were beginning to trust each other. Not because they had to, but because, together, they had survived the fiercest storm either of them had ever faced. Spring arrived quietly at Iron Ridge Ranch. The snow that had buried the valleys for weeks slowly melted into clear streams that rushed through the meadows. Green grass pushed through the frozen earth. Wildflowers returned to the hillsides, and the ranch seemed to breathe again. Workers laughed more often. Horses filled the pastures once more. The smoke rising from the ranch house chimney no longer felt lonely. Yet while the land healed, another problem was quietly growing beneath the surface. Caleb noticed it first during the monthly livestock count. He stood beside Tom Watkins, his oldest ranch foreman, comparing numbers in the ledger. Tom scratched his beard. "We're missing 18 head. Caleb frowned. "Search the north pasture." "They're not there." "The south." Tom slowly shook his head. "We've searched everywhere." Caleb looked down at the figures again. 18 cattle didn't simply disappear. Someone had taken them. That evening he spread maps across the dining table while Lydia poured fresh coffee. She noticed his expression immediately. "What's wrong?" "Cattle are disappearing." "How many?" 18. She remained quiet for a moment. "Have they disappeared all at once?" "No." "When did it begin?" He handed her the ledger. She studied every page carefully. Her eyes moved from one column to another. Then she stopped. 3 months ago." Caleb looked surprised. "You found that already?" She nodded. "The losses started just after Mr. Dawson became livestock manager." Harold Dawson had replaced the previous foreman only 6 months earlier. He appeared hardworking, always respectful, always ready with an explanation. Perhaps too ready. The next morning Caleb rode through every pasture himself. Nothing. No broken fences. No unusual tracks. Everything appeared normal. Too normal. Meanwhile, Lydia continued examining ranch records. Late that afternoon, Martha found her surrounded by stacks of papers. "My dear," Martha laughed, "you've turned the dining room into a bank. I'm looking for something." "What?" "A lie." Martha smiled. "You always find them." Hours later, Lydia finally did. Several cattle sales had been recorded twice. Feed purchases listed animals that no longer existed. The handwriting changed on only a handful of pages. Small differences. Easy to overlook. Unless someone was paying close attention. She carried the ledger directly to Caleb. "I think someone's stealing from us." He studied the pages. "You're certain?" "I wouldn't accuse anyone unless I was." Caleb leaned back slowly. "Dawson, I believe so." Instead of confronting the man immediately, Caleb decided to wait. "If he's stealing cattle," Lydia said, "he isn't working alone." "You think someone in town is helping him?" "I do." "Then we need proof." Over the next week, they quietly watched. Caleb pretended everything was normal. Lydia continued organizing household accounts as though nothing had changed. Dawson grew comfortable. Too comfortable. One moonless night, Tom knocked urgently on Caleb's bedroom door. "Boss." Caleb opened it immediately. "What is it?" "Dawson." "What about him?" "He's moving cattle." "Now?" Tom nodded. 3 wagons. Caleb dressed in seconds. Within minutes, 6 trusted ranch hands rode silently across the fields beneath the cover of darkness. Lydia watched them leave from the porch. Something inside her felt uneasy. She whispered a quiet prayer. The riders followed fresh wagon tracks toward an abandoned canyon several miles away. Hidden among cottonwood trees stood 3 large cattle trailers. Lanterns flickered in the darkness. Caleb counted at least 8 armed men. Harold Dawson stood among them, laughing with another ranch owner. Victor Kane. Everyone in Montana knew Kane. He had spent years trying to buy Iron Ridge Ranch. Every offer had been refused. Now Caleb finally understood. If enough cattle disappeared, if the ranch suffered financial losses, perhaps Kane believed Caleb would eventually sell. Caleb signaled his men. "Wait." They listened carefully. Kane's voice drifted through the night. "Another month," he said. "Mercer won't know what hit him." Dawson laughed. "His pretty wife spends more time with books than cattle." Caleb's jaw tightened. Tom whispered, "That's enough." Caleb nodded. They rode forward together. Harold, every head turned. Lanterns swung wildly. Dawson's face turned white. "Boss, you've been busy." Victor Kane stepped forward calmly. "I don't see any crime here. You'll have plenty to explain to the sheriff." Kane smiled. "I don't think so." He reached slowly toward his revolver. Everything happened at once. A gunshot shattered the night. Horses reared. Men scattered. Caleb threw himself behind a wagon as bullets struck the wooden wheels. Tom and the ranch hands returned fire into the darkness. Smoke filled the canyon. Kane's hired men fled toward the trees. Dawson tried escaping with them. Caleb chased him on horseback. The pursuit stretched across rocky ground beneath the moonlight. Dawson's frightened horse stumbled crossing a creek. Both rider and horse crashed into shallow water. Before Dawson could stand, Caleb reached him. "It's over." The former foreman slowly raised his hands. "I never meant. You sold this ranch for money. I had debts. So did plenty of honest men." The sheriff arrived before sunrise after hearing gunfire from nearby ranchers. Ledgers, bills of sale, witnesses, everything Lydia had uncovered fit together perfectly. Harold Dawson confessed. Victor Kane was arrested alongside 2 livestock buyers who had helped hide stolen cattle. Nearly every missing animal was recovered. Iron Ridge Ranch had been saved. Word spread quickly across Red Willow. For the first time, people spoke Lydia's name with genuine respect. No longer as the forgotten Holloway daughter. Now she was known as the woman who had saved one of the largest ranches in Montana. Several weeks later, Edwin Holloway unexpectedly arrived at Iron Ridge. He looked older, more tired than Caleb remembered. Victoria and Eleanor accompanied him. Their elegant clothes seemed strangely out of place among dusty barns and hard-working cowboys. Victoria looked around in surprise. This place. She stopped. Flower gardens surrounded the porch. Fresh paint covered the ranch house. Children of ranch workers played beneath giant oak trees. Workers smiled as they passed. Everything felt alive. This isn't what I imagined, Eleanor admitted quietly. Martha welcomed them inside. Lydia met them in the front hall. She wore a simple blue dress with rolled sleeves. No expensive jewelry. No grand display. Only quiet confidence. Victoria embraced her awkwardly. You look. She searched for words. Happy. I am. Edwin cleared his throat. I wanted to thank you. Lydia looked surprised. For what? I spent years believing success came from appearances. His eyes filled with regret. I almost overlooked the best thing God ever gave me. Lydia stepped forward and hugged her father. You see me now. I do. And I'm grateful. Even Eleanor smiled. I suppose I judged your husband unfairly. Caleb entered the hall, carrying a toolbox. He paused upon seeing the unexpected visitors. Victoria laughed softly. So, you really do repair fences yourself? Caleb glanced at Lydia. Someone keeps giving me projects. Lydia smiled innocently. The west pasture still needs work. He chuckled. I had a feeling you'd mention that. Everyone laughed. It was the first genuine laughter the Holloway family had shared in years. Summer arrived. The ranch prospered beyond anything Caleb had imagined. Workers received higher wages. New barns replaced old ones. Fresh orchards were planted near the creek. Even neighboring ranchers sought Lydia's advice on bookkeeping and supplies. One warm evening, Caleb asked Lydia to ride with him into the hills overlooking Iron Ridge. They stopped at a grassy ridge just as the sun began sinking behind distant mountains. Lydia looked around. Something was different. A white wooden gazebo stood beneath a large cottonwood tree. Wildflowers surrounded a stone pathway. A wooden swing hung from one beam. She stared in amazement. When did you build this? Caleb smiled. While you were busy rebuilding everything else. She slowly walked through the garden. Birds sang from nearby trees. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender and fresh pine. It's beautiful. I remembered something. She turned toward him. What? The night we first spoke. He stepped closer. You said silence feels peaceful when it's shared with the right person. Her eyes filled with tears. I never forgot. Caleb reached into his coat and removed a small brass key. She looked at it curiously. What does it open? The old greenhouse behind the ranch. The broken one? It isn't broken anymore. He placed the key gently into her hand. I rebuilt it. She smiled through happy tears. You did. You've spent the last year repairing my ranch. He gently took both of her hands. I wanted to build something that belonged only to you. She looked toward the greenhouse in the distance, its new glass windows shining in the evening light. Caleb's voice grew quiet. When I came to Red Willow, I thought I needed a wife to protect Iron Ridge. He shook his head. I was wrong. She stepped closer. You didn't save my ranch, Lydia. You saved me. Tears rolled gently down her cheeks. She rested her forehead against his. And you gave me something I never believed I'd have. He smiled. And what's that? A place where I was never invisible. Caleb wrapped his arms around her as the golden light of sunset spread across the valley below. The workers returning home smiled when they saw the couple standing together on the hill. Iron Ridge was no longer simply a successful ranch. It had become a home. Months later, as autumn painted the hills with shades of gold once again, Caleb and Lydia sat together on the porch with 2 steaming mugs of strong black coffee. Neither spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. The wind moved gently through the fields. Horses grazed peacefully below. Children's laughter drifted from the bunkhouse. Caleb lifted his mug. No sugar. Lydia laughed. Some things never change. He took a sip before smiling at the woman beside him. No, they don't. And as the sun disappeared beyond the endless Montana horizon, they sat together in the quiet they had both spent their lives searching for. Not the silence of loneliness, but the comforting peace of 2 hearts that had finally found home in each other.